Off the Wall Productions is proud to present Voices of the Methow. This is a series of conversations with interesting folk in and around the valley. Hey, this is Byron, and I have Lynx here with me. Welcome to the show, Lynx.
Hi.
Before we get started, can you give a brief introduction of yourself for people who may not be familiar with you?
Yeah, I've been living in the Methow Valley now for 11 years, and you can probably tell from my accent that I'm not from here originally, and I'm not from New Zealand. That's where most people think I'm from. When people say, well, where are you from? I don't have a very short answer, but I like to say I come from the high places, the mountains all over the world, but my physical body was actually brought into being in England. And my parents, my mother's Swedish and my father was English, so I consider myself a little bit of a global citizen, I suppose, at this point.
Yeah, okay. And you've been doing primitive skills for quite a while, haven't you? Been interested in that?
Yep. Yeah, about, 25 years ago, I started to get involved in, I guess you could call it the primitive skills movement here in the United States. And it was such an eye-opener, you know, because I was one of those kids who would like to play in the woods and climb in trees and stuff like that. And I remember really clearly, like, rubbing sticks together when I was a little kid. Like, I know people used to make fire this way, but how did they do it? And then when I discovered the tracker school in New Jersey a long time ago, and actually found that there was a place where you can go and learn these skills that I thought nobody in the world except myself was interested in, I leapt at that. And I've been teaching those skills ever since. And I guess the way that I've been doing it is I'm really drawn to the Stone Age technology. Rather, it's not like survival. I'm not really into surviving stuff. I'm more into just like living with nature and on the earth and in community. So it's like an exploration of how do we use the tools and the nature that's around us to meet our needs, you know, wild food, and then how do we live together in a way that is, you know, a natural and a healthy way to live.
Yeah. Well, we're sitting in a really nice house that you have here up the Twisp River. As we were walking in, it just feels like going back in time a little bit. You know, there's it's not plowed, so you're walking on a path, you know, ski and snowshoe tracks there and whatnot.
Yeah, I always like that feeling of instead of like getting out of your car and poof, like being in your house, to have that little lag time where you get to be in nature. And winter time's the perfect time for it because it costs, hundreds of dollars to plow the driveway here. But I've never plowed the driveway here except for with my horses. I would plow a little trail just to walk in or ski in, and it gives you just like 5 minutes to just like get a sense of like where you are before you go back inside.
Yeah. So I hear you've been hanging out with Bushmen in Namibia. That sounds pretty cool. Would you please tell us about your adventures and maybe start by mentioning where Namibia is?
Yeah, Namibia. Namibia is north of South Africa. So it's the southern tip of Africa, north a little bit, and to the west. Yeah, that's where it is. And the first time I was there was actually about 3 years ago, and I was invited by an English survival school, I suppose, bushcraft school, to go out there and take some students from England and work a little bit with the Bushmen. But we had a couple of trackers from the village, and we spent most of the time just with our own group, and the trackers were teaching us stuff and so on. But then when we took them back to their villages, and I got to see what the village was like and the village life was like, and that was so much more fascinating to me. So earlier this year, I met some other friends who live in South Africa, and they wanted to do another program with the Bushmen, but this time it was going to be focused in the village and with the Bushmen, the whole village all the time. And so I just leapt at that chance.
I'll bet.
Yeah.
Well, we were talking a little beforehand here, and you were mentioning that there's quite a few pieces to this. What you've been doing. Can you fill it out just a little bit more about how maybe the younger bush people are being trained in their skill in the skills of and it might perhaps even they might be able to sustain themselves a bit with their skills.
Mm-hmm. Okay, yeah. So 30 years ago, approximately 30 years ago, the first wells were drilled for the bush people, and that's essentially when they stopped being nomadic hunter-gatherers. So they've been sedentary for about 30 years now, the last of them. Some of them it happened before that. But so when that happened and they became sedentary people, then all the things that happened to people who were hunter-gatherers started to happen to them, and, the most glaring things are, alcoholism, suicide rates, losing cultural identity, etc. So all these things started to happen. But then a friend of mine who I have been working with over there, he's from Namibia, he's of German extraction, but he recognized that they needed to have a way to support themselves, to give them a business, essentially. If they weren't able to be wandering around on the land anymore and hunting and gathering as they used to, they needed to be able to do something that would generate an income for them. So he talked and worked with them a lot about creating, they call it right now, a living museum, where they have a museum where tourists and visitors can come and pay them for seeing, to watch their traditional skills and to learn them. Yeah. So it gives them like a way to keep doing what they've always done, but actually generate a little income, because now in this new lifestyle, they want some of the modern things that we all have too. Yeah. So this started, I don't know how many years ago now, maybe 10 or 15 years ago, something like that. And the village where we went, the idea was that instead of we just come for an afternoon like most tourists do, and they see, they show them how to make fire and they show them how to make a bow, etc., we actually spend a more intense time with them. So we took with us about 50 impala hides, untanned, and we went like really in-depth workshops with them. How do you create your tools? How do you tan your hides? How do you do all of these things? And then we went out on a little walkabout. And the fascinating thing this time to do it in this way was that many of the younger people who've been born, since the beginning of the wells being drilled, is they haven't had any need for their traditional skills. So when there's no need for something, then quickly you can lose interest for something, right? But when they see that their elders, not only do they have this knowledge, but there are Europeans who are willing to come and pay them to actually learn how to do it, it's like a little double incentive, So we had kids coming in the village and tanning their first hides ever, and making their clothes, and they start to see that this is actually really advantageous for them in all ways, really. So they won't need to go into the towns and get, menial labor jobs to generate income. They can actually, work with tourism in a way that will not only uphold their traditional living style, but also generate the income that they need and they want for some of the modern things.
Yeah, well, that sounds great. And you were there with some Europeans, was it?
Yeah, we were a group of, 12, 13, 14, 15. We were 15 people of European extraction. I shouldn't say we're all Europeans, but there was an American, a Canadian, a couple of South Africans, and a Namibian, and myself. And then a bunch of other people from mostly Germany and England, I think. And most of us are or have been working, in the nature awareness genre, I guess you could say. And so we all, have our own schools, and we can bring the knowledge that we gained from the Bushmen back and apply them not only to our own work and projects, but to our communities.
Were you able to share some of your knowledge with the Bushmen at all? I mean, or just compare different ways that you tan a hide versus their tanning process, or?
Yeah, actually we did that. And for them, that's really unusual because, most of the tourists that come to them don't have any clue about, any of these ancestral skills. So I think they really enjoyed that a lot. And I did tan some hides the way that we do it here. But all the time I was recognizing that it really doesn't make sense to do, say, hide tanning is a really good example, in a place that's so different than here. For one is there's really no surface water in the Kalahari most of the year. So to do a wet scraped deer hide, it doesn't really make sense, especially when you're pulling the water up out of the well to do it. But I kept being faced with all of these things, like they don't smoke their hides and we do here. Well, why would they? It only rains in the rainy season and it's still hot. So it's like you just take your clothes off, and they won't get wet. So they were very intrigued with this hide smoking thing that we do and this, wet scraping thing. And then I tried bark tanning there too. And I, don't really know what any of the trees and how much tannin is in the barks of the trees there. So it was just all a bit of an experiment. But it was really fun, and it was fun for them to see, there are people out here doing things in different ways. And they're very curious people, and I think they really enjoyed it too. So yeah, we did get to do a lot of exchange in different skills too.
Yeah.
Some of them, I think they just think we're very funny, strange people. It was like, I didn't remember this at this time particularly, but I've heard people say in the past that they will show Bushmen how to do a bow drill fire. And all the Bushmen do hand drill fires, so you just have 2 sticks. It's very, very simple technology. And they just think that's the funniest thing, to go to all of that effort to create, this bow and this string, and then have to have something to hold it down with, and when you can just have 2 sticks. It's like you strip away all the extraneous and you just have the most simple thing. And that's one of the things that stood out for them the most for me there, I guess, is it's like living stripped down to its basics, and there's so much beauty in that.
Yeah. You're going to be giving a presentation here next week, aren't you?
Yeah, I'm going to be at the community center on Thursday the 11th at 7 p.m. and I'm going to do a short presentation of my experience there with some slides and some writings from my journals. And then I'm going to be showing a film called The Great Race that's been a very well-received documentary of the Bushmen.
Oh, great. Yeah, I'm looking forward to that. Well, what's on the horizon, Lynx, as far as where are you going from here?
Yeah, my life seems to be bopping around quite a bit right now. Next week I'm going to be heading back to the Swedish Arctic. I am somewhat based now on the Arctic Circle in a little town called Jokkmokk, which is about the same size as Twisp. And traditionally it's a Sami community, the reindeer herding people of the north. There's probably 50% Sami who live there and 50% Swedish, and actually quite a lot of immigrants too. And refugees are being placed up in that region as well. And so I'll be there for a month, and I'm going to be teaching some winter skills classes up there, and doing some cultural stuff with the Sami people. And then from there I'll head back down to France, where I'm also based. I'm going to ride my horse, who I actually flew out there this summer. Yeah.
Great.
She's not going to have a return trip. She had a one-way ticket because it was pretty expensive. But I'm going to ride with a friend of mine, Bernice Endy. She's a long rider. She's ridden for the last 13 years, I think it's about 30,000 miles or something. So wow. She's going to join me over in France, and we're going to do a ride over to the Pyrenees and down to Spain probably. And we haven't decided our route yet, but that will probably take us, I think we got at least 6 weeks or 2 months or something like that. And then I'll be teaching down there as well for several months, and then back to Sweden for a few months, and then I'll come back up here in the end of the summer.
Oh, great. So you'll be back around the end of the summer, huh?
Yeah, that's the plan. Yeah, I can never... Every time I think I'm leaving for good, then I realize that the Methow Valley's definitely got a hook in me.
Well, that says quite a bit for the Methow Valley from all these other cool places you're hanging out. But this is so cool how you're bringing different cultures, sharing, different information and primitive skills. That's good for you.
Yeah, it's really a fascinating opportunity, yeah. One thing that is really pertinent about just community living, I hear a lot about community living here in this valley, and people are pretty conscious about that, and people will help each other and so on and so forth. And I just wanted to mention how watching, I keep coming back to the Bushmen, because I watch the way that they live, and the way that they are, I feel like it's the way that we inherently all were or could be, if we, so when we strip away all of this extraneous stuff that, fills us with fear and suspicion, and you get left with like a natural way of living, and not only that, but they're really embodied by the land. I see how the land has actually shaped them for 60, 80,000 years, and they are really the primary people. Did you know that all of us carry the DNA of the Bushmen?
No,
yeah,
I didn't.
Every single person alive on Earth. So it's like they are the first people, and they're still there. They're the last of the first people, but they've been living on that land. They have been shaped by that land. They have shaped the land too. And when I see what happens when we become disconnected from the land, wherever we are, whether we're Europeans extracted and then replaced and born in North America, for example, something gets cut, and if you don't have a connection with the land and with the earth, then something really vital is lost in our humanness.
Well put. I actually Googled the Bushmen in Namibia, and I was looking at videos and just, and I was struck by there's a quality of their interacting with themselves and just their own, I don't know if I can really even quite describe it, but it felt like a connection. Mm-hmm. I mean, with the group, within their group, and that they were connected in a way that I don't feel myself, connected in groups too often, for example.
Mm-hmm. Let me give you I can give you a couple of examples. So our camp was separate from the village, but it was close to them, their own day-to-day village. So every day we would have a bunch of kids that would come over to our place, almost probably a third of their village are children under 10 or 12 years old. And so a bunch of kids would come over, and all these little boys, they would start playing with the bows, because we had some bows in our camp, and they would start shooting bows at this little grass springbok that somebody had made. So I always would imagine, now what would happen if you got 15 little American kids trying to share two bows, and they're the ages of 5 through 12. And it would just be chaos,
right.
Havoc, screaming and tears and probably a lot of pain too, right? So watching these little boys sharing, and the bigger boys giving to the little boys, everybody taking their turn, watching everybody, they would have this, you didn't even need to tell them to do anything. You didn't need to tell them to be careful. You didn't have to set parameters or rules. It was just natural in them. So that was one thing that stood out. And another example was there were a couple of kids who joined us one day. We were having like a little meeting in our group, and they just sat quietly in our circle, and someone brought them a cup of water. So they shared this cup of water, these three little guys. And then they couldn't understand what we were saying because we were speaking in English. They don't speak English. But they sat there quietly and drinking their water. And then when they were done drinking, one of the little boys picked up his cup that he'd been given and went back over to the kitchen and put it on a table. And for some reason, this really struck me too. There was a couple of things. One is that they live on the sand. The sand monster will eat things. Like, you leave something in the sand and it will disappear. The second thing is that when you have few material possessions, you recognize the value of things. And then I guess the third thing is that they have a really deep respect for other people and their physical boundaries and their physical possessions. And I just tried to superimpose that again onto, American culture,
Right,
it's like
right.
you pretty much have to pull teeth to get kids to pick up the stuff that they got strewn all over the place, right?
Right.
But here in this culture, people have, and the kids too, they have this totally different way that they interact with the world around them. And another example I would offer would be, it was very, when we were together in the village, when they would come over to our camp, it was always like the men would sit on one side and then the women would sit with the little children on the other side. And then the sort of teenagers would have their own little groups, but it was very much gender separated. But not in it didn't feel like an unhealthy way, actually. But and there was always, if there was a question to them, there was always a lot of discussion. And it wasn't like just the men spoke or just the women spoke. There was always like this lively conversation that would go on amongst everybody. And to my ears, it sounded really kind of chaotic, if someone asked a question, there'd be this talk, and they had this clicking tongue, and then it'd be decided. And it was like they would come to some kind of consensus by all talking at once. I don't even understand how they do it, but maybe after, 80,000 years of living on that land and being shaped by it and working together and probably, being born and being raised and growing up with a group of people that you've known since you were a child, that has a lot to do with it. But there's this understanding, like you said, there's something, they got something. It's the key. They got a key.
Yeah. Well, is there anything that we maybe missed or that you'd like to add to before we finish up our conversation?
Well, I'm going to go back. I'm heading back there probably for at least 1 or 2 months again this year. Now I've got another continent to love.
Yeah,
it's kind of a hard thing, But I see these people, they're on like the brink of something like enormous, where they're already like stepping into it kind of a thing. And so I want to be able to, be a part of, maybe in what small way I can, like easing their transition. And
well, I got that, and that's part of why I'm here, is because when we were talking the other day about maybe doing a conversation that we're doing today, I was intrigued by exactly that you were perhaps able to help these people, in a way, or at least by getting a message out anyway. And
well, one of the biggest issues that they have there is the village we lived at. They actually are allowed to hunt, but in many of the villages, they live in areas where they're not allowed to hunt anymore. So the land issues are really a big deal there. And, having them being able to maintain the legal right to exist and to live on their land as they have always, that's a really vital thing. And I have other friends who are also working with Bushmen in other places where it's not quite so easy for them because they have no land rights and they're not allowed to hunt. They're not allowed to go gather. And so I'm not quite sure how it's going to look, but, I have friends who are working on like buying land and so that it can be gifted back to the Bushmen.
Right.
And so I will be taking donations at the slideshow that will be put to a good cause for the Bushmen.
Yeah, that's just right. Good deal. Well, Lynx, let me ask you this. On one hand, you're really involved in primitive skills, Stone Age crafts and whatnot, and on the other, you're flying in airplanes around to different places on the globe. And how do you balance that out?
Yep, that's probably the hardest thing, actually. I've thought about that a lot, and at some point, I don't know, it seems like I keep adding new continents. One thing that I do try and do is when I'm in a place where I can easily travel from one place to another without getting in an airplane, for example, I try to keep it on the ground.
I heard that, yeah.
So, so I've been doing that as much as possible. And at some point, I'm probably going to just say enough. At some point, I'm just going to say enough.
Right.
And I will stay on the ground or
one way
my
or
horse
another.
or travel by sailboat or something like that. Because it's not, it's not sustainable. And I don't even want to try and justify it or something like that. It's like, no, this is my addiction right now. I'm traveling around the world and I'm flying in airplanes, and it's not a good thing.
Well, yeah, and you probably have a pretty small footprint, I imagine, in between the getting on the airplane and getting off again. But,
yeah, in between maybe, but jet fuel is jet fuel.
It is, yeah. Well, Lynx, is there any where people can go to get more information on these Bushmen?
Well, there's lots of possibilities and availability just, Googling Namibia or Googling the sand Bushmen in Namibia or Botswana for that matter. There are a couple of really nice movies. One of them, The Great Race, I'm going to be showing at the community center. And the other one is called My Hunter's Heart, and I think they're both available on YouTube. So you can check that out. And it will give you a little bit more of a sense of who these people are and how they fit in the world, both today and in previous times.
Right. Well, Lynx, thanks so much for this conversation. I really wish you well, and I'll be interested in what stories you have when you come back.
Thanks so much, Byron. It's been a pleasure.
Okay, thank you.
You've been listening to Voices of the Methow, an off-the-wall production. Until next time, thanks for listening.